The horrifying case of the Wynn sisters' sexual practices. That's what the county records called it in 1905. Two sisters, one intellectually disabled cousin, and a father who twisted the Bible into something unspeakable. In the remote town of Havenwood, Elias Wynn had a plan to keep his bloodline pure. His daughters, Beatrice and Eleonora, became secret wives to their own cousin, Silas. Child after child was born in darkness. Child after child died in silence. The graves were unmarked. The town knew. The sheriff looked away. But when a young doctor arrived and discovered the truth, everything began to unravel. Scripture became a weapon, fear became law, and an entire community chose silence over justice. How many children died in that house of horrors, and how far would a father go to protect his twisted legacy? The autumn wind carried more than fallen leaves through the streets of Havenwood in 1905. It carried secrets that had festered in the shadows for far too long. Dr. Alistair Finch pulled his coat tighter against the October chill as he guided his horse down the rutted path toward the Wynn farm, his medical bag bouncing against his thigh with each jarring step. The urgency in young Timothy's voice still echoed in his ears. "Doctor, you must come quickly. Miss Beatrice, she's in a bad way." The boy had vanished into the darkness before Alistair could ask more questions, leaving him to wonder what emergency could possibly require his services at such an ungodly hour on the most isolated farm in the county. Havenwood had welcomed Dr. Finch 6 months earlier with the cautious optimism of a community long accustomed to making do without proper medical care. The previous doctor had died of consumption 3 winters past, and the townspeople had grown resigned to treating ailments with folk remedies and fervent prayer. Alistair's arrival had been seen as a blessing, though he quickly learned that blessing came with unspoken boundaries. Certain families, certain situations, certain questions were simply not his concern. The Wynn family, he had been quietly informed by more than one well-meaning neighbor, preferred to handle their affairs privately. Their faith was strong, their patriarch resolute, and their need for outside interference minimal. It was advice Alistair had heeded until tonight, when desperation had apparently overridden the family's legendary insularity. The Wynn farmhouse loomed against the starless sky like a monument to stubborn endurance, its weathered clapboard siding and sagging porch speaking of decades of hard labor and harder winters. Lamplight flickered behind drawn curtains, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent purpose. Alistair had passed this property countless times during his rounds, always noting its eerie stillness, the way it seemed to exist apart from the rest of Havenwood's modest bustle. No children played in the yard, no neighbors stopped for casual conversation, no courting couples walked the fence line on Sunday evenings. The Wynns lived as if surrounded by an invisible barrier that kept the world at bay. Elias Wynn himself answered the door before Alistair could knock, his gaunt frame filling the doorway like a scarecrow given life. The man's pale eyes glittered with an intensity that made Alistair's skin crawl, though his voice remained steady and carefully controlled. "Doctor, we appreciate you coming so quickly. My daughter requires your services." The words were polite enough, but something in their delivery suggested this was less a request than a command, as if Alistair's presence had been ordained rather than summoned. Elias led him through a modest parlor where religious texts lay open on every available surface, their pages marked with annotations in a careful, obsessive hand. Biblical verses had been copied onto scraps of paper and tacked to the walls, creating a tapestry of Scripture that felt more oppressive than comforting. In the dim hallway, Alistair caught his first glimpse of the family dynamics that would haunt him for months to come. Eleonora Wynn, the elder daughter, moved through the shadows with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to crisis. Her plain brown dress and severely pinned hair spoke of rigid propriety, but her eyes held a watchfulness that suggested she was constantly calculating threats and responses. She barely acknowledged Alistair's presence, focused instead on carrying clean linens and boiled water with the mechanical precision of someone performing a familiar ritual. Behind her lurked Silas Wynn, the family's intellectually disabled cousin whose massive frame and vacant expression created an unsettling contrast. The young man watched Alistair with the unblinking curiosity of a child, though his physical presence radiated an adult strength that could prove dangerous in the wrong circumstances. "Upstairs," Elias commanded, his tone brooking no delay. "Beatrice has been laboring since yesterday evening. She has not been well." The careful phrasing set off alarm bells in Alistair's professional mind. Women in labor were rarely described as not well, unless complications had progressed far beyond normal discomfort. He followed Elias up creaking stairs that seemed to groan under the weight of unspoken secrets, each step bringing him closer to a truth that would shatter his understanding of human decency. The bedroom door opened to reveal a scene that would be burned into Alistair's memory forever. Beatrice Wynn lay on a simple iron bed, her face pale as winter moonlight and slick with perspiration. She could not have been more than 25 years old, but suffering had carved lines around her eyes that belonged to a much older woman. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps that spoke of prolonged agony, and her hands clutched the bed sheets with desperate strength. Most shocking of all was the obvious evidence that this was not her first childbirth. Her body bore the unmistakable signs of previous pregnancies, yet Alistair had never heard mention of Beatrice Wynn being married or courted by any man in Havenwood. The pieces of this puzzle were already forming a picture too horrifying to accept. "How long has she been like this?" Alistair asked, setting down his medical bag and moving toward the bed. Beatrice's eyes found his, and in them he saw not just physical pain, but a soul-deep terror that made his blood run cold. She tried to speak, but Elias's sharp voice cut through the room like a blade. "She has been in God's hands since yesterday. We had hoped prayer would be sufficient, but—" He left the sentence hanging, as if divine intervention had simply taken longer than expected. Alistair's examination revealed complications that required immediate intervention, but as he worked, he became increasingly aware of the family's strange behavior. Eleonora hovered near the door like a sentry, her eyes never leaving her father's face, as if awaiting silent instructions. Silas remained in the hallway, his heavy breathing audible through the thin walls, creating an atmosphere of barely contained menace that made Alistair's hands shake as he delivered the sickly infant into the world. The child was alive but clearly struggling, its breathing labored and its coloring poor in ways that suggested serious internal defects. Alistair had seen such symptoms before, in cases where the parents were too closely related, though he pushed such thoughts from his mind as he focused on keeping both mother and baby stable through the night. When he finally worked up the courage to ask about the father, the room fell silent with a weight that seemed to press against his chest. Elias's pale eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, while Eleonora stepped forward protectively. "Family matters are private matters, Doctor," the patriarch said, his voice carrying a threat that needed no elaboration. "Surely a man of medicine understands the importance of discretion?" The infant died 3 days later, as Alistair had feared it would, and when he attempted to investigate further, he found himself facing a wall of silence that extended far beyond the Wynn farmhouse into the very heart of Havenwood itself. The infant's death haunted Dr. Alistair Finch like a persistent fever, its pale face appearing in his dreams and its labored breathing echoing in the silence of his empty office. Sheriff Morton had ruled the death an act of God with disturbing swiftness, refusing even to examine the child's body or question the circumstances of its birth. When Alistair pressed for a more thorough investigation, citing the obvious signs of genetic abnormalities, Morton had fixed him with a cold stare and suggested that outsiders who stirred up trouble in peaceful communities often found themselves unwelcome. The warning was clear, but Alistair's conscience would not allow him to simply accept what his medical training told him was a preventable tragedy born of something far more sinister then divine will. His first attempts at gathering information were met with the same wall of silence that had greeted his questions at the Wynn farm. Mrs. Henderson at the general store suddenly developed selective hearing whenever Alistair mentioned the family, busying herself with inventory that didn't need counting. The postmaster claimed to know nothing about the Wynns beyond their reputation for paying their bills on time and keeping to themselves. Even the town's longtime residents, people who had lived in Havenwood for decades and knew every family's secrets and scandals, grew uncomfortably quiet whenever the conversation turned toward the isolated farm on the ridge. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been forged long ago to simply pretend the Wynns existed in a separate world that bore no examination or interference. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martha Caldwell, the pastor's wife, whose quiet demeanor masked a sharp intelligence and a troubled conscience. She approached Alistair after Sunday service, ostensibly to discuss organizing a charity drive for the county's orphans, but her real purpose became clear when she mentioned having observed the Wynn sisters over the years. "Those poor girls," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as they walked through the church cemetery. "I've watched them age 10 years in the span of 5, and neither one has ever been courted by a single young man in this town. Their father turns away every caller, claims they're needed at home for the farm work. But what kind of farm work keeps 2 healthy young women locked away like prisoners?" Martha's words carried the weight of years of suppressed suspicion, and when she mentioned having seen Beatrice in town several months earlier with the telltale signs of pregnancy, Alistair felt the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. Through Martha's careful inquiries among the church ladies, Alistair learned that the Wynn family's isolation had deep roots stretching back generations. Elias's own parents had been first cousins, a union that had produced 3 children, Elias himself and 2 siblings, who had died in infancy under mysterious circumstances. The family had a pattern of intermarriage that violated both social norms and genetic wisdom, justified through a twisted interpretation of Old Testament passages about keeping bloodlines pure. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that Silas, the intellectually disabled cousin now living with the family, was actually the product of another cousin marriage and had been taken in by Elias after his parents died, in what was reported as an accident but whispered about as something far more suspicious. The real breakthrough came when Martha mentioned Jacob Henley, a former farmhand who had worked for the Wynns several years earlier, but had since descended into alcoholism and now spent his days nursing bottles of cheap whiskey behind the abandoned mill. Alistair found him there on a gray November afternoon, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling as he stared into the murky water below. At first, Jacob refused to speak about his time at the Wynn farm, claiming he had signed papers promising his silence in exchange for generous compensation. But as the whiskey loosened his tongue and the weight of his secret grew unbearable, he began to hint at things he had witnessed that violated every law of God and man. "Those girls," he slurred, his voice thick with self-disgust and buried knowledge, "they ain't never had a chance at normal lives. And that cousin of theirs, he ain't just living in that house as family. There's things that go on after dark that no Christian should have to witness. But Elias pays well for blind eyes and closed mouths, and a man's got to eat." Jacob's cryptic words painted a picture too horrifying to fully accept, yet too specific to dismiss as the ravings of a drunk. Armed with this disturbing intelligence, Alistair decided to risk another visit to the Wynn farm, this time under the pretense of checking on Beatrice's recovery from her difficult labor. The November wind cut through his coat as he approached the farmhouse, noting how the property seemed even more desolate in the harsh light of late autumn. Elias received him with barely concealed hostility, insisting that his daughter was recovering well and had no need for further medical attention. But when Alistair mentioned the professional necessity of ensuring no complications had developed, the patriarch reluctantly allowed him upstairs, though Eleonora hovered nearby like a watchful guard dog ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble. Beatrice looked even frailer than before, her pale skin almost translucent, and her eyes holding the hollow expression of someone who had lost all hope. When Alistair asked routine questions about her recovery, she responded in monosyllables, clearly terrified of saying anything that might displease her father. But when a noise from downstairs drew Eleonora away for a crucial moment, Beatrice grabbed Alistair's wrist with surprising strength and whispered words that would haunt him forever. "Doctor, please," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "You must understand what happens in this house. My sister and I, we are not spinsters by choice. Our father has made us wives to Silas, our own cousin. In ceremonies he performs himself using twisted scripture. We have both borne children to him, one after another, and they all die because of what we are forced to do. This baby that just passed was my fourth child. Eleonora has lost 6. Our Father says it is God's will to keep our bloodline pure, but I know it is an abomination that kills innocents and damns our souls." The confession poured out of her in desperate whispers, each word a dagger thrust into Alistair's understanding of human depravity. "Please help us," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks, "before we are forced to bring more cursed children into this world." The sound of Eleonora's returning footsteps forced Beatrice to release his wrist and return to her passive demeanor. But the damage was done. Alistair left the farm that afternoon with the full weight of the truth pressing down on his shoulders like a millstone. As he rode back to town through the gathering darkness, he realized that his simple desire to practice medicine in a quiet rural community had thrust him into a battle against forces far more evil than he had ever imagined. The scope of the Wynn family's corruption was vast and deep-rooted, protected by a network of complicity and fear that extended throughout Havenwood itself. Yet as the cold November wind whipped around him, Alistair felt a grim determination settling in his chest. Whatever the cost to himself or his career, he could not allow this horror to continue unchallenged. Dr. Alistair Finch's first mistake was believing that truth would triumph simply by being spoken aloud. Armed with Beatrice's whispered confession and the mounting evidence of the Wynn family's horrific secrets, he marched into Sheriff Morton's office 3 days after his disturbing farm visit, convinced that presenting the facts would compel immediate action. Morton listened to his account with the patience of a man humoring a child's wild imagination, occasionally nodding and making non-committal sounds that suggested professional interest. But when Alistair finished his urgent plea for investigation, the sheriff leaned back in his creaking chair and fixed him with a look that was equal parts pity and warning. "Doctor," Morton said slowly, as if explaining something to a particularly dense student, "you've been in Havenwood for less than 8 months. The Wynn family has been pillar of this community for 3 generations. You're asking me to believe that one of our most respected citizens is forcing his daughters into incestuous relationships based on the hysterical ramblings of a woman who just lost a child." The dismissal was complete and devastating, delivered with the calm authority of a man who had clearly had this conversation before and knew exactly how it would end. Alistair's second mistake was approaching Pastor Caldwell, Martha's husband, and the spiritual leader of Havenwood's largest congregation. The pastor received him in his study, surrounded by theological texts and religious artifacts, presenting the image of scholarly wisdom and moral authority that had made him the town's unofficial arbiter of right and wrong. Alistair laid out his concerns carefully, couching them in terms of Christian duty and the protection of innocence, believing that a man of God would surely be moved to action by evidence of such profound evil. Pastor Caldwell listened with the grave attention befitting his office, occasionally stroking his graying beard and murmuring thoughtful responses that suggested deep consideration. But his next Sunday sermon delivered Alistair's answer with devastating clarity. Standing before his packed congregation, the pastor spoke eloquently about the sanctity of family privacy and the dangerous sin of gossip that could destroy innocent reputations. "There are those among us," he intoned with biblical gravity, "who would spread malicious rumors about our neighbors, who would tear down what God has built up simply to satisfy their own pride and sense of importance. We must guard against such poisonous influences and remember that bearing false witness is among the gravest of sins. The message was unmistakable, and every eye in the congregation seemed to find Alistair's face as the pastor's words rang out like a condemnation. The town's rejection of his efforts might have broken a lesser man, but it only strengthened Alistair's resolve and deepened his alliance with Martha Caldwell. The pastor's wife had watched her husband's sermon with barely concealed disgust, and that evening she appeared at Alistair's door with a basket of food and a determination to see justice done regardless of the personal cost. "My husband is a good man in many ways," she said as they sat in his modest parlor, planning their next move. "But he values peace above truth and order above righteousness. Some of us cannot live with such comfortable compromises." Together, they began the painstaking work of documenting the Wynn family's dark history, cross-referencing birth and death records that showed a disturbing pattern of infant mortality stretching back over 2 decades. Martha's position as the pastor's wife granted her access to church records and social circles that would have remained closed to Alistair, while her reputation for discretion allowed her to gather information without arousing the same suspicion that now followed the doctor's every move. Their most significant breakthrough came when Martha managed to obtain Beatrice's hidden diary, a small leather-bound journal that the young woman had secreted away in the church during a rare visit to town. The diary's pages revealed a catalogue of horror written in Beatrice's careful hand, dates of forced encounters with Silas, records of pregnancies and miscarriages, desperate prayers for deliverance that had gone unanswered. The entries painted a picture of systematic abuse that had begun when both sisters reached their 16th birthdays, orchestrated by their father through a twisted interpretation of biblical passages about maintaining tribal purity. "Papa says we must keep the bloodline clean as Abraham's children did," one entry read. "But I know in my heart that God never intended such suffering. The babies come wrong and die wrong, and I fear my soul is damned beyond redemption." The diary also revealed the true extent of Elias's control over his daughters' lives. He held legal ownership of the farm despite their decades of labor, controlled every penny of their earnings, and had systematically driven away every young man who had ever shown interest in courting either sister. As Alistair and Martha deepened their investigation, the community's hostility toward the doctor intensified with frightening speed. Patients who had once praised his skill began canceling appointments and spreading whispers about his unprofessional behavior and dangerous ideas. Mrs. Henderson at the general store suddenly found reasons to be unable to serve him, claiming shortages of items that sat plainly visible on her shelves. The blacksmith refused to shoe his horse, the baker would not sell him bread, and even children on the street began crossing to the other side when they saw him approaching. Anonymous notes appeared under his door, warning him to mind his own business or face consequences that were left deliberately vague but unmistakably threatening. His medical practice, which had been thriving just weeks earlier, dwindled to nothing as word spread that associating with him carried social and economic risks that no family could afford to take. The isolation was complete and suffocating, designed to break his spirit and drive him from Havenwood before he could cause further disruption to the town's carefully maintained silence. Sitting alone in his empty office as November rain drummed against the windows, Alistair began to question whether he possessed the strength to fight a battle that the entire community seemed determined to lose. The evidence of the Wynn family's crimes was overwhelming, but evidence meant nothing without a system willing to acknowledge and act upon it. Sheriff Morton had made his position clear, Pastor Caldwell had chosen complicity over courage, and the townspeople had demonstrated their preference for comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Even Martha, brave as she was, could only do so much without risking her own position and safety. As the weight of Havenwood's corruption pressed down upon him, Alistair found himself wondering if some evils were simply too deeply rooted to be exposed, too widely accepted to be challenged, and too powerfully protected to be defeated by one man's determination to see justice done. The discovery of the unmarked graves came on a bitter December morning when frost turned the world into a crystalline wasteland that reflected Alistair's increasingly desperate state of mind. Martha had suggested they search the Wynn property under cover of pre-dawn darkness, reasoning that physical evidence of infant burials would provide the undeniable proof they needed to force official action. Armed with a lantern and a borrowed shovel, they made their way across the frozen fields behind the farmhouse, following Martha's recollection of seeing Elias and Silas digging in this area during previous visits to comfort the bereaved family. What they found beneath the frost-hardened earth exceeded their worst fears. 7 small graves arranged in careful rows, each marked only by rough stones that bore no names or dates. The tiny remains they carefully exhumed told a story of genetic catastrophe that could only result from repeated inbreeding, malformed bones and skulls that spoke of nature's rebellion against the abomination being forced upon her. As they worked in horrified silence, documenting each discovery with Martha's careful sketches and Alistair's medical observations, both understood they had finally uncovered evidence that no amount of influence or intimidation could explain away. Armed with this grim proof, Alistair made what he believed would be his final visit to Sheriff Morton's office, carrying photographs of the remains and detailed medical documentation that proved beyond doubt the systematic abuse occurring at the Wynn farm. This time, Morton's dismissive attitude cracked under the weight of undeniable evidence, his confident smugness giving way to the trapped desperation of a man whose comfortable corruption was finally being exposed. "You don't understand what you're asking me to do," Morton said, his hands shaking as he stared at the photographs that destroyed any pretense of ignorance. "Elias Wynn owns half this county through debts and favors, and the other half through fear and blackmail. You think I became sheriff because of my sterling character and dedication to justice? 20 years ago, I made a mistake, got drunk, and killed a man in a bar fight, claimed it was self-defense when it wasn't. Elias was there that night, saw what really happened, and he's owned me ever since." The confession poured out of Morton like poison from a lanced wound. Years of suppressed guilt and shame finally given voice in the face of evidence that could no longer be ignored. But Elias Wynn had not maintained his stranglehold over Havenwood for 3 decades without learning to anticipate threats and neutralize them before they could grow dangerous. Within 48 hours of Alistair's confrontation with the sheriff, a formal complaint was filed with the State Medical Board alleging gross professional misconduct, ethical violations, and the spreading of malicious falsehoods designed to destroy a respectable family's reputation. The complaint, signed by a dozen prominent Havenwood citizens, including Pastor Caldwell and several of Alistair's former patients, painted him as an unstable outsider whose professional jealousy and personal failures had driven him to fabricate evidence against innocent people. The charges were specific and devastating, allegations that he had violated patient confidentiality, diagnosed conditions he was not qualified to identify, and engaged in inappropriate relationships with female patients while under the influence of alcohol. Alistair's medical license was immediately suspended pending investigation, effectively ending his career and stripping him of the credibility necessary to pursue his crusade against the Wynns. The next blow fell with equally brutal efficiency when Jacob Henley, the drunken former farmhand who had provided crucial testimony about the family's dark secrets, was found dead in the mill pond on a frigid January morning. The official cause of death was drowning while intoxicated, a conclusion that surprised no one given Jacob's well-known struggles with alcohol and his habit of drinking near the water. But the timing of his death, coming just days after he had finally agreed to provide Alistair with a written statement about what he had witnessed at the Wynn farm, struck both the doctor and Martha as suspiciously convenient. Without Jacob's testimony, they had lost their only witness who could speak directly to the abuse occurring within the farmhouse walls, leaving them with nothing but circumstantial evidence and the word of victims too terrified to speak publicly about their ordeal. The final crushing blow to Alistair's efforts came when a pale and trembling Beatrice Wynn appeared at Pastor Caldwell's Sunday service, flanked by her father and sister, like a prisoner being escorted to her execution. In a voice barely above a whisper that nonetheless carried to every corner of the packed church, she delivered a carefully rehearsed statement that destroyed the foundation of Alistair's entire case. "I must confess to this congregation that I have sinned gravely against my family and my community," she said, her words clearly memorized and delivered with the mechanical precision of someone reciting under extreme duress. "In my grief over losing my child, I spoke rashly and foolishly to Dr. Finch, allowing him to misunderstand innocent family arrangements and twist them into something evil and unnatural. My father and sister have never harmed me, and my cousin Silas is a gentle soul who has been nothing but kind and protective. I ask forgiveness for the pain my careless words have caused and beg this community to reject the lies being spread about our family." The recantation was complete and devastating, delivered before the very people Alistair had hoped to convince of the truth. Eleanora followed her sister's statement with her own fierce denunciation of Alistair's character and motives, her voice ringing with righteous indignation as she painted him as a predator who had taken advantage of her family's grief to advance his own twisted agenda. "This man came to our home during our darkest hour and used our pain to feed his sick fantasies," she declared, her eyes blazing with what appeared to be genuine outrage. "He has violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency in his obsession with destroying our family's reputation. We are simple, God-fearing people who have done nothing but live according to our faith and take care of our own. Yet this outsider would tear us apart with his lies and accusations because he cannot tolerate our independence and devotion to traditional values." Her performance was masterful, combining wounded dignity with moral superiority in a way that left the congregation nodding in sympathetic agreement and casting hostile glances toward Alistair's isolated pew. With Beatrice's recantation destroying his credibility, Jacob's death eliminating his key witness, and his medical license suspended pending investigation, Alistair's crusade against the Wynn family collapsed like a house built on sand. The unmarked graves had been explained away as the final resting place of stillborn infants and miscarriages, tragic losses that any farming family might experience over the course of decades. His photographs and medical documentation were dismissed as the fabrications of an unhinged mind seeking to justify his unprofessional behavior. Even Martha found herself unable to continue their partnership as her husband threatened to seek her commitment to an asylum if she persisted in supporting what the entire community now viewed as a dangerous delusion. Sitting alone in his empty office as January snow blew against windows that no patience would ever darken again, Alistair finally understood the true scope of his defeat and the terrible power of a community united in its determination to preserve comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The February morning when Dr. Alistair Finch loaded his few remaining possessions into a hired wagon marked the end of what he had once believed would be a noble calling in service to a grateful community. His medical practice lay in ruins, his reputation destroyed by whispers and accusations that followed him through Havenwood streets like a plague, and his savings nearly depleted by months of professional exile. The townspeople watched his preparations with the satisfied expressions of citizens witnessing the departure of an unwelcome intruder, their collective sigh of relief almost audible in the crisp winter air. Even Martha Caldwell, his sole remaining ally, could offer nothing more than a tearful farewell and a pressed flower from her garden as a token of gratitude for his failed but necessary crusade. As he prepared to climb aboard the wagon that would carry him away from the scene of his greatest defeat, Alistair felt the crushing weight of knowing that Beatrice and Eleanora Wynn would continue their nightmare existence while he retreated to lick his wounds in some distant place where his failures could not follow. But Martha Caldwell had not survived 30 years as a pastor's wife without learning that sometimes the most powerful acts of rebellion came disguised as conventional piety. That very Sunday, as her husband delivered his usual sermon about community harmony and the dangers of divisive thinking, Martha stood before the women's auxiliary meeting in the church basement and spoke words that would shatter the foundations of Havenwood's carefully constructed silence. "Sisters," she began, her voice trembling but determined, "we live in a community afflicted by a sickness of silence, where the cries of the innocent are muffled by our fear of uncomfortable truths. We have allowed ourselves to become complicit in evil through our refusal to see what stands plainly before our eyes. There are those among us who suffer in darkness, while we sing hymns and pretend all is well with our souls. How can we claim to follow Christ's teachings of protecting the vulnerable while we turn our backs on those who need our courage most?" The words hung in the basement air like incense, sacred and dangerous, as 24 women shifted uncomfortably in their chairs and avoided each other's eyes. But the seed had been planted, and truth has a way of growing even in the most barren soil. Beatrice Wynn heard about Martha's courageous words through the kitchen maid who attended the auxiliary meetings, and for the first time in her 26 years of existence, she glimpsed a world beyond her father's iron control. That night, as Elias slept soundly after consuming his customary evening dose of laudanum for his failing health, and while Eleonora dozed fitfully in her nearby room, Beatrice made a decision that would require every ounce of courage she possessed. Moving through the darkened farmhouse with the stealth born of years of fearful obedience, she gathered her hidden diary from its secret place beneath a loose floorboard and retrieved a small wooden box from behind the kitchen stove, a container that held her mother's letters, written decades earlier, and hidden away by the woman who had endured the same horrific fate now being visited upon her daughters. The letters, penned in a shaking hand and stained with tears, told of forced marriages to cousins, of children born wrong and buried in shame, and of a legacy of corruption that stretched back 3 generations. Armed with this evidence and wearing her mother's old traveling cloak, Beatrice slipped into the February night and began walking toward a freedom she had never dared imagine possible. The journey to the county seat took her 18 miles through snow-covered fields and frozen streams, her feet bleeding inside her worn boots, and her breath coming in painful gasps as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her determination. But when she finally staggered into the sheriff's office in the neighboring town, clutching her precious evidence against her chest like a sacred relic, she found something that had been absent in Havenwood, a lawman named Thomas Brady who listened to her story with growing horror and immediately recognized the jurisdictional authority to investigate crimes that crossed county lines. Brady's examination of her diary and her mother's letters, combined with his knowledge of Alistair's suspended medical license and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the doctor's departure, convinced him that a grave injustice had been perpetuated under the protection of local corruption. Within days, county investigators descended upon the Wynn farm with legal authority that Sheriff Morton could not challenge or obstruct, armed with warrants to exhume the unmarked graves and arrest those responsible for decades of systematic abuse. The arrests came swiftly and without fanfare, as if the very earth had finally rebelled against the abominations it had been forced to conceal. Elias Wynn, caught off guard by the arrival of county authorities who answered to no local influence, crumpled like ancient parchment when confronted with the evidence his daughter had provided. His decades of absolute control evaporated in the face of legal power that extended beyond Havenwood's borders, and his desperate attempts to invoke religious freedom and family privacy fell on deaf ears trained to recognize criminal behavior regardless of its justification. Eleonora, faced with the destruction of everything she had sacrificed her life to preserve, suffered a complete mental collapse that left her raving about biblical duty and family loyalty, even as the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Silas, found cowering in the barn like a frightened animal, was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial and committed to the state institution where he would spend his remaining years under medical supervision. The trial that followed became a sensation that drew newspaper reporters and curiosity seekers from across the state, all eager to witness the exposure of what journalists dubbed the Havenwood Horror. Day after day, the courtroom filled with spectators who listened in fascinated revulsion as prosecutors laid bare the systematic abuse that had flourished under the protection of community silence and institutional corruption. Alistair's testimony, delivered with the careful precision of a medical professional presenting clinical findings, restored his reputation while simultaneously destroying the illusion of Havenwood's moral respectability. The physical evidence spoke with undeniable authority: the malformed remains of 10 infants, the documented genetic abnormalities that proved repeated inbreeding, and the written confessions in Beatrice's diary and her mother's letters that traced the family's corruption back decades. When the verdicts were finally rendered, Elias Wynn received a sentence of life imprisonment for multiple counts of incest, child abuse, and conspiracy to conceal crimes, while Eleonora was committed to a psychiatric facility where she would spend her remaining years insisting that she had only tried to protect her family from a world that could not understand their sacred mission. The trials fractured Havenwood's community along lines that would never fully heal, as neighbors who had maintained comfortable silence for decades suddenly found themselves forced to confront their complicity in enabling unspeakable crimes. Sheriff Morton resigned in disgrace. Pastor Caldwell left his ministry under a cloud of moral failure, and dozens of families packed their belongings and departed for places where their association with the town's shame could not follow them. Alistair's vindication brought him offers to return to Havenwood or establish a practice in the county seat, but he chose instead to accept a position in a distant city where he could serve patients who had never heard of the Wynn family or the young doctor who had refused to remain silent in the face of evil. On his last day in the county, he visited Beatrice in the modest boarding house where she was learning to live as a free woman, finding her pale but determined as she prepared to begin a new life under an assumed name in a place where no one knew her history. "The cost was higher than either of us imagined it would be," she told him as they sat in her small room, sunlight streaming through windows she could open whenever she chose. But the truth needed to be spoken, no matter how much it hurt to hear. As Alistair left that final meeting, he carried with him the knowledge that justice, however delayed and however costly, had finally prevailed over the conspiracy of silence that had protected evil for far too long.